Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Sheila Crane, and I am the current chair of the Architectural History Department here at the University of Virginia. Welcome, everyone, to what promises to be a fantastic two-day symposium. Welcome back to many of you. And I am just going to say a few brief words. We have the luxury of having a day and a half of reflections and reminiscences, and I hope we all look forward to all of those. But I will try and keep my welcome brief before handing things over to Sally Butler, who will frame the symposium a little bit more specifically. But I'd just like to say, on behalf of the Department of Architectural History and the entire School of Architecture, we are so thrilled to have you all back. We are honored to have had the work of so many of you focused on putting together what is a spectacular marathon run through a wide range and spectrum of presentations that really are going to do an extraordinary job in showing just how broad and how deep Richard Guy Wilson's impact on architectural history is. I don't need to say to this audience that at the University of Virginia, in the School of Architecture, architectural history is central to our mission. We pride ourselves on having the longest, or one of the longest, programs in architectural history in the country, if not the world. And the extraordinary work of the long generations of faculty working here have had such an impact on the field. But perhaps few more than Richard Guy Wilson. I actually did start trying to count the number of theses and dissertations with which Richard was involved, and at a certain point just gave up. But I think many people in the room are a testament to that, the expanded field of history that Richard's work and his teaching has represented. The themes that we will encounter over the next few days really demonstrate the breadth of interests. Richard is someone with an encyclopedic knowledge, one who is always interested to pay as much attention to the most renowned monuments of architectural history and the most ignored. Someone who insists that we look at the broad cultural landscape and we pay attention to the chair. Someone who has had an extraordinary impact as a teacher, as a researcher and publisher, as someone who has mounted an extraordinary number of exhibitions, and as someone who has really been the public face of architectural history, thinking about the history of the built environment, something that was accessible and is accessible to a broad spectrum of the population. And I think it's especially that legacy that we here in the School of Architecture look forward to continuing. And I will tomorrow evening speak a little bit more about the future of our programs, but we are proud to continue to have a burgeoning program in architectural history at the undergraduate level. Our numbers of majors in this past 6 months have doubled or tripled. So we are growing. We continue to have many majors. Our program in historic preservation is under the leadership of Andy Johnston, growing and changing and introducing new technologies and new tools to our students. Students are minoring in historic preservation at the undergraduate level. And at the graduate level, our program in the Masters of Architectural History continues continues apace with some exciting new changes in the curriculum that I'll speak more about later. And the Historic Preservation Certificate Program really touches students across the School of Architecture. And excitingly, in the future, will be available to graduate students across the university to partake of the certificate program in historic preservation, which will be a great way also to bring students from the college in the graduate school into the School of Architecture. The department also continues to play an active role in our 2 PhD programs, the PhD in Art and Architectural History, that we jointly, is a joint endeavor of architectural history and our colleagues in art history, and the relatively new PhD in Constructed Environments that is an interdisciplinary PhD program across all 4 of the disciplines in the School of Architecture. So I am going to turn things over to Sally Butler, who will help put the symposium in a little bit of context and say a few words about Richard as well. But welcome to all of you. I look forward to having a chance to speak with all of you in the coming days.
Well, welcome and good afternoon. This symposium is in honor of Richard Guy Wilson, but by extension, it's also for all of us. And so for me, it's a happiness and a joy. Oops. Have I not been heard? Okay. For me, it's a happiness and a joy, and I'm borrowing a phrase here, I love this phrase, from our first president, Edwin Alderman. It's a happiness and a joy to welcome our architectural history community back to our home in Campbell Hall. Our time here has been our time here indelibly molded our thinking, scholarship, careers and professions, and our networks of friends and peers. The number of people gathered for this symposium is a tribute in its own right. There are over 150 of us, and is a tangible sign of how much Richard and the Department of Architectural History mean to us. This symposium is also the culmination of an effort that began 2.5 years ago when a small group, and I'd like to point them out, the members, first of all, Margaret Grubiak. Margaret, there she is. If we have any questions, please turn to one of us. Margaret Grubiak, Paula Moore, also back there, Paula. Christine O'Malley up here at the front, right there. Well, this is the group, and I also, in this, floated the idea to Richard for a symposium to reflect on and honor his teaching and scholarship. Of course, Richard demurred, saying he didn't want a big fuss, and sending us lots and lots of emails, bubbling over with his signature ... But we persisted, and ultimately, we eventually wore him down. And hey, let's be real. For anyone who knows Margaret, that person knows he had no chance. And we're also delighted to have this opportunity to thank at least some who stepped forward to offer assistance and financial support for us. Dean Isla Berman, members of the architectural history faculty, especially Sheila Crane, who's just spoke with us, department assistant Shelley Miller. I don't know if Shelley's here. Yep, Shelley, thank you. And Dick Smith, whom many of us know from our time in the A School. And I also want to thank the members of the Jefferson chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians, particularly the president of the moment, Wade Goodrich. And we appreciate the involvement today of a number of our students in the architectural history program. Beat goes on. And I also want to thank, finally, those who served on the paper selection committee. These are all graduates of the program, as well as the session chairs today, and we'll be introduced to them a little bit later. Outside the department, we're grateful for the support of the A School Foundation, especially Joey Pierce and Jennifer Berman. And also, we appreciate the work of Snehal Patel and Kelly Bryant of the A School Communications team. You can see what a big work staff, what a big project this has been. But we're most grateful to all of you for coming from near and far, from all over the country to share your scholarship, time, and conviviality with us to honor the individual known affectionately as the guy. Just a few logistics, and if there are any questions about how things are going to operate, please let one of the four of us know. As you note in your program, the symposium is arranged in sessions, loosely organized around a theme. We have some great papers. I'm looking forward to hearing them. And these will update us on the work of our peers, which is exciting in its own right. But we also ask the presenters to point out connections between the work presented and Richard's teaching and scholarship, underscoring, as Sheila just said so beautifully, the breadth of his work. All papers will be presented right here today and tomorrow in Campbell Hall 153. For those registered for the closing reception tomorrow night, that will take place in the Rotunda Dome Room. Should be a really nice event. And it's great to see all of you here. So thank you for coming and welcome. Finally, I want to turn this over to Lori Osman, who is one of our early PhD candidates and graduates. She works in the preservation field and also in house museums. She's had a long career there. She's the author of 3 books, and most recently with another one of our graduates, Deborah McLean. So please join me in welcoming Lori Osman.
Thank you, Sally, and thanks to the committee for inviting me to chair this session. And it is a great honor and a privilege to be here and to be associated with a tribute to our own RGW. One piece of housekeeping: I have been asked to that you keep your questions until the end of all the papers in the session, and there will be 4. In the case of this first one, aptly enough, dealing with different aspects of influence and challenges and opportunities therein. Our first speaker will be Lisa Schrenk. Lisa is Associate Professor of Architectural History and a Faculty Fellow at the University of Arizona. Her research focuses on international expositions and the early work of Frank Lloyd Wright. She has documented works of architecture in over 75 countries, including while teaching around the world semester at sea voyages. She served on the board of directors for the Society of Architectural Historians and president of the Chicago Society of Architectural Historians. Her paper today is entitled An Architectural Laboratory, the Oak Park Studio of Frank Lloyd Wright. Please welcome Lisa D. Schrenk.
Let's see if you can go back to the first slide. So you get a quick... Okay. Already technical difficulties, so I've broken the ice. I really thank everyone who helped organize this symposium to honor Richard Guy Wilson. Over the past 30 years, shared interests in a variety of topics in modern architecture have led my path to occasionally cross that with Richard Guy Wilson's. This includes working together from around 2004 to 2010 on a major exhibition at the National Building Museum on American World Affairs, and most recently, involvement in an NEH Summer Institute on Hoover Dam, where I had the pleasure of hearing him lecture once again. Much of Richard's research and teaching has been extremely influential to my own career, and I thank you, Richard. One topic of his past research that strongly connects to an area of my own work is the early exploration of the Prairie School in the Midwest. In honor of his retirement, my paper today examines a central site in the development of the Prairie School, Frank Lloyd Wright's Oak Park Studio. Shortly after receiving my master's degree from UVA in 1988, I was hired as education director of the Frank Lloyd Wright Home and Studio Foundation
and began a detailed exploration into Wright's early independent architectural office, which after 30-plus years and hundreds of hours in various archives is the topic of an upcoming book from University of Chicago Press. And the manuscript, all the permissions are due on Monday, so things are a little bit crazy right now. Wright's suburban studio was set apart from more traditional architectural offices in the Chicago Loop and appreciably evolved both in physical forms and in the activities that took place within its walls during the years of its operation, 1898 to 1909. Wright used the building itself as an exploratory design exercise as he matured into one of the leading architects of his time and developed his own form of modern American architecture. At a scholars conference held in the drafting room of the Oak Park studio on Halloween Day, I'm on the East Coast now, 1976, a group of notable Wright scholars and family members, including Wright's son Lloyd, came to the decision to restore the former Oak Park home and studio to its condition in 1909, the last year the architect lived and worked there. This meant significant restoration work on the property, as at the time the building was deemed architecturally confusing, having lost the thrust of Wright's original inspiration. Divided into 6 separate apartments, the complex had deteriorated significantly and was filled with, quote, green shag carpet, water-damaged walls, and uneven floors. Window frames in the former drafting room were painted a garish red, and some of the walls had been covered in flowered wallpaper. Lloyd was greatly dismayed that so little of his childhood home remained visible through its various modernizations. Restoring the building to 1909 meant replacing original Wright designs made after that date with replicas of what was believed to have been in place that year as the architect continued to design significant alterations for his former Oak Park property years after he closed the studio, the latest made only 3 years before he died and just 20 years before the Scholars Conference. The decision to restore the building to a specific date and time is one that may not would be made today, but was met with resistance even in 1976. Lloyd, who we see here in the circle, fought hard for the 1911 cantilever over the studio interest to remain, arguing it was the kind of the initial idea for the cantilevers at Fallingwater. Detrimentally, the restoration has left what had been a vibrant, ever-changing building in a static state, reflecting a moment in time when Wright had essentially checked out of his suburban studio as he schemed to escape what he growingly viewed as suffocating living and working conditions by heading to Europe with his married former client, Mama Cheney. The building's brief life as a studio can be divided into 3 major phases, defined by Wright's own architectural development, office procedures, and relationship with associates. What I want to do today is to provide brief insight into each of these periods and then address how the building continued to evolve even after Wright's departure. There are many reasons Wright shunned working in a more traditional architectural office in the Loop. As a farm boy, he never felt fully comfortable in an urban setting. Oak Park in the 1890s still offered open prairie, as well as a stream of potential residential clients, and the opportunity to create a workplace that was more in keeping with the arts and crafts workshop. It also meant that he could integrate his home and work lives. The location additionally offered a more comfortable environment for both the women who worked with him, and there were several, and for female clients. By situating his Oak Park home to the south edge of the site in 1889, he left room along Chicago Avenue for the office he built 9 years later. The unusual-looking brick and shingle studio included a large 2-story drafting room attached to an octagonal-shaped library by a low reception hall with a business office in the rear. As with his home next door, from the start, Wright began to make changes to the building. During these early years, the alterations were mostly minor design refinements. One of the first, carried out within months after the studio opened, involved rotating the eastern boulder figure at the entrance 90 degrees so that sculptor Richard Bach's crouching man faced west. Although it might appear to be a rather insignificant modification, by rotating the sculpture, Wright achieved a greater sense of balance to the composition, while at the same time making the identical sculptures appear as 2 unique works. And this gets into the whole kind of rotation of horrible exercises that he participated in as a child, and at the time there was a horrible kindergarten going on next door in the home. The first period of the Oak Park Studios operation, from 1898 to 1902, was one of the most fertile eras of Wright's career, as he surrounded himself with gifted, academically trained architects like Walter Burley Griffin, Marion Mahoney, and William Drummond. Isabel Roberts, often labeled as office secretary, also arrived with impressive credentials, having just completed 3 years of formal architectural training in New York City under French designer Emmanuel Louis Masqueret and his American colleague, Walter Chambers. Wright had a continuous fertile interaction with his talented employees, as well as with colleagues outside of the studio, as he and the other progressive Chicago area architects defined the basic characteristics of the Prairie House in these years. In Oak Park, exchanges included office debates and competitions, particularly with Mahoney and Griffin, which proved to be an effective spur to innovation. Articles in House Beautiful and Architectural Review during these years helped to publicize the studio and Wright's developing ideas. The second phase of the studio between 1903 and mid-1905 formed an extremely hectic time for Wright as he progressed into an established designer while overseeing his active office. In addition to continuing to produce Prairie houses for clients in the Chicago area, the studio carried out several large projects connected to Buffalo businessman Darwin D. Martin. The most significant involved the design of the Larkin Company Administration Building, Wright's first prominent commercial building. Major alterations to the studio were made possible by fees associated with the Martin-related designs. To meet the needs of the increased workload, Wright hired a number of additional employees with various levels of training and previous experiences, including Charles White and an additional female designer, Marion Chamberlain, who, like Mahoney, received her training at MIT. The office was the largest in 1903 and 1904, when he also augmented his staff with part-time and temporary hires. This resulted in a growing division of office labor. During these years, Wright continued personal explorations of nature and geometry that he began as a child and urged his employees to do the same. He also encouraged them to experience other sources of inspiration, including attending the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, where they saw the work of Peter Behrens and the Viennese secessionists for the first time. However, within the walls of the studio, lively dialogues, such as those which took place in the early years, began to ebb as the architect focused more on his own continuing architectural development and left much of the learning process of his newer and younger designers to other experienced members of the office, like Griffin and Drummond. Even with major project deadlines looming, Wright had no qualms with stopping work production to make major alterations to the office, letting the work wait. In 1904, studio architect Charles White reported that twice a year, Mr. W. rearranges and changes the different rooms. He says he's gotten more education in experimenting on his own premises than in any other way. Some of these alterations were extensive, including explorations into the quality of masonite as a concrete binder for floors and other surfaces by laying a new floor of the material throughout the whole studio prior to specifying it in the Larkin building, as well as adding a second level of windows to the upper level of the drafting room to provide more natural light, which involved raising the edge of the roof, which you can see in the drawing there. And you can just barely make out the two layers of the drafting room, also adding a wall across the front, creating more of a path of discovery, changing the urns, and a lot of other minor changes. Other less disruptive alterations tied to his developing ideas on the manipulation of space, including installing various forms of vertical and horizontal members that offered visual but not physical support. This busy phase of his career ended with a period of exhaustion and growing restlessness both in his personal and professional lives, resolved, albeit only temporarily, by a trip to Japan beginning in 1905, the beginning of 1905. The architect's 3-month absence, however, derailed office momentum and contributed to growing tensions between himself and several of his more advanced employees, in particular Griffin, who had been entrusted with running the studio in his absence. The last major phase of the studio's operations began after Wright returned from the Orient and was marked by a greater turnover in office staff, most significantly the departure of Griffin in early 1906. The edifying conversations that filled the studio in earlier years further dwindled as the architect began hiring exclusively younger and less experienced designers. This made it easier for him to mold his employees to meet his specific needs of his own design procedures. Except for a few commissions Wright found particularly interesting or challenging, he became less engaged in day-to-day studio operations, often delegating major design responsibilities, particularly on the more mundane residential projects. Wright continued to make some changes to his Oak Park property. They tied less clearly to his architectural development. A commission to design a new home for his Unitarian congregation just a few blocks away from the studio took over as the main setting for his design explorations, including new ideas that developed out of his time in Japan. Well, there are many parallels between the design of Wright's suburban studio and Unity Temple, the path of discovery to get into the building, the binuclear layout of the design, the use of piers and wood banding and art glass. The church reflects a significantly more sophisticated understanding of space. Wright, in fact, recalled near the end of his life, "Unity Temple is where I thought I had it. This idea that the reality of a building does not consist in the walls and roof, but in the space within." In 1908, as major construction work on Unity Temple was ending, Wright experienced another lull in his practice. He had envisioned that projects like the Larkin Building and Unity Temple would lead to other prominent non-residential commissions, but they did not appear. In January 1909, Wright reported to English architect Charles Ashby that the previous year had been a lean one. With growing frustration, he closed the studio that September, leaving his family and suburban community behind, and headed to Europe to reflect upon his early career as he prepared the Vosmuth Portfolio, a major retrospective of his early architectural work. The importance of the Oak Park studio to Wright, even after his departure, is reflected in the extensive design changes he made to the building in 1911 as he transformed it into a residence for his estranged wife, Catherine, and their 4 youngest children, and the original house into rental property. Changes Wright made to the original home were relatively minor. In contrast, dramatic alterations took place in the former studio. He has installed a floor over the drafting room balcony opening and squared off the octagonal form of the second floor to create 4 bedrooms. You can see one in the lower center. He transformed the drafting room into a living room, which you can see on the lower left, replacing the original fireplace facade of Chicago common brick with a rectangular opening of Roman brick, not that unlike designs that he did for Roby and other recent commissions. He also converted the studio office into the family's dining room and added a new bedroom above for Catherine. Some changes, such as the new Roman brick fireplace, illustrate that Wright went far beyond making modifications to just meet the building's changing functions. On the west wall of the new dining room, the architect removed windows and added French doors with an abstract composition of geometrical forms suggesting possible influence of the secessionists from Europe. The art glass design of the doors extends across the mullions into the skylight, and clerestory windows created a unified whole, with the side light panels recalling a geometrical abstract vine. The practice of producing a comprehensive glass design that extended over a series of windows was soon more fully realized in his design for the Coonley Playhouse. And the image on the lower left, you can see the construction of a new wall that went around this new garden area off the library. The exterior of the studio was significantly altered beyond squaring the upper level of the drafting room. Most dramatically, to fill existing niches on the second floor, Wright turned to artist Richard Bach. The new sculptures are reminiscent of the first project the artist carried out for the studio building, the stork panels at the entrance. Whereas the open book is missing, the tree of knowledge and the scroll are both present. In the new composition, boys take the place of the storks. Wright had a difficult time keeping his former home and studio maintained and rented. After Catherine moved out in 1918, architect Ralph Schindler occupied the studio rent-free while overseeing Wright's Chicago office, while his employer was in Tokyo trying to secure the commission for the Imperial Hotel. Wright encouraged Schindler to borrow rugs, bedding, or furniture from Taliesin and make any reasonable investment to make the place comfortable and rentable. The young designer discovered that the building leaked like a sieve, and even after being armed with oakum putty, etc., found it comfortable in only mild weather. Expected to make needed repairs to the building, he struggled through several rounds of work on the heating system and plumbing. Wright had placed the Oak Park home on the market in 1915, even though he did not have clear title of it. He used it for collateral for loans, including to build Taliesin. Finally, in 1924, with the help of Darwin Martin, who possessed trust deeds on the property, the whole complex went up for sale. Local brokers already residing in the building bought it in 1925 with a $25,000 loan from Martin. The former studio once again formed the center of artistic activity, this time as the first permanent home of the Austin, Oak Park, and River Forest Art League. The house next door, meanwhile, served as the residence and studios of artists throughout the 1920s and 30s, including for a Russian sculptor, a prominent local painter, and a musician who taught music to children. There were continual issues with the building, including deteriorating conditions and tenants not paying rent. In the 1930s and 40s, the building twice went up for auction and changed hands. In 1947, Clyde and Charlotte Nooker purchased the property, initially living in part of the former studio and renting out the rest of the building, now divided into 6 units. 9 years later, the couple hired Wright to produce designs for a new bathroom, a dressing room area of Philippine mahogany, and an updated kitchen. Wright encouraged the Nookers to restore the building, telling them that he hoped they would keep up the old place from falling apart. The couple soon began fixing art glass windows and refinishing woodwork. Around 1966, they opened some of the complex to the public, and a steady stream of curious people toured the unusual-looking building. The visit included parts of the home and the first floor of the drafting room. Due to the numerous post-1909 alterations and the fact that most of the original furniture and much of the decoration had been removed or altered, visitors found it extremely difficult to comprehend what the space was like when Wright lived there. In 1974, after the Oak Park Development Corporation purchased the building, the Frank Lloyd Wright Home and Studio Foundation was established and offered its first public tours that July. Almost immediately, emergency work was carried out to stabilize the building, and after 1976, scholars meeting, a meticulous $2.5 million restoration began. A major issue with the 1909 restoration is that visitors to the site do not come away with the understanding of how the building evolved, nor how it fit into the architect's design development. The drafting room in particular feels sterile, having been almost completely rebuilt with new material and void of any evidence of the lively interactions that took place there when it served as Wright's architectural office. While it's impossible to gain an understanding of the restored building's evolution, I was hired to oversee the development of a rich assortment of educational programs and materials to help its interpretation. One of the most successful programs offered for well over 25 years was a summer architectural design workshop. Within the walls of the drafting room, hundreds of future architects have explored the basic building design and the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. Students intently work at drafting tables in the same space where Wright and his employees have produced designs for such spectacular buildings as residences for Susan Lawrence Dana and Unity Temple. As the students discuss their innovative design ideas, one could imagine the voices of the architects who worked in the space a century earlier, echoing in the room as the studio once again served as a lively space of architectural development. However, the echoes reveal a major disconnect between the Oak Park studio as restored, largely frozen in time, and its rich past. Today, there's little evidence of the evolving conditions of the building and the active life that took place within to help the over 90,000 annual visitors comprehend its significant role in Wright's personal and professional development, and more broadly, in the development of modern architecture in the United States. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we're off to a roaring start. Our next speaker, Christine O'Malley, received her master's and PhD in architectural history from the University of Virginia and currently works in preservation services and research in historic Ithaca in Ithaca, New York. Previously, she taught at Ithaca College, Carleton College, and St. Olaf College. Her research focuses primarily on 20th century North American architecture, and she serves as first vice president of the Vernacular Architecture Forum. Her article, first of all, The Founding of Alpha Phi Alpha and the Search for Fraternal Space at Cornell University, 1905 to 1920, appears in the recent edition of the journal Buildings and Landscapes. Today, her paper is entitled Out from Raymond Loewy's Shadow, William Snaith and Mid-Century Design.
Well, thank you all for being here. It's really wonderful to see everyone. This is a lot of fun. So it's pretty hard to resist starting this presentation without including this item from the late 1990s on the left side of your screen, an artifact. Richard's famous handouts complete with cartoons. If you took Richard's 20th century American architecture class, you might remember the photograph from his lecture on streamlining and industrial design in the 1920s and 1930s, this photo on the right. It's often reproduced in many books on Raymond Loewy and American industrial design. It shows him gracefully posing in a designer's office and studio, a space of streamlined refinement with drawings and models as props. The photograph, of course, is a wonderful fantasy. The designer's office and studio was a stage-like setting created for a 1934 exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's not a true functioning office, but rather it projects an image that Loewy wished to convey, a way to attract the public's attention to his nascent profession, industrial design. Loewy's unquestionable success in his field is frequently recounted in histories of 20th century industrial design. He built an active firm with multiple offices, both in the United States and abroad, that for decades served clients in all aspects of design during an era of explosive growth for consumer products and services. What is less understood about his firm's operation is the valuable role played by the skilled architect and designer William Snaith, who you see on the right. Trained as an artist and architect, Snaith joined Loewy's office in 1936, soon leading the store planning and architecture division and turning it into the most profitable arm of the firm. In 1951, when Loewy's book Never Leave Well Enough Alone came out, Loewy declared that Snaith was, quote, one of the most remarkable brains that I have ever met, in or out of business. Snaith's contributions allowed Loewy's firm to operate as the premier full-service industrial design office during the mid-century in the United States. Yet despite this high praise from Loewy, why are we remarkably unfamiliar with Snaith's work today, with little in-depth analysis of someone so crucial to the success of Loewy's office? So I'd like to explore this question, starting with a short overview of Loewy's career, and then turn to Snaith's achievements within the firm, ones that earned him a respected reputation in store design and architecture circles. With Snaith's sudden death in 1974, I argue that we arrive at the crux of the problem. Loewy, who outlived Snaith by 12 years, was able to shape the narrative and history of the firm's work and commissions to his personal advantage, particularly near the end of his life, reinforcing the idea of Loewy as the single creative genius. Raymond Loewy's heyday was from the 1930s through the late 1960s, and it occurred during the flourishing of what Randolph McCausland remarked was the management era. That's when manufacturers, eager to listen to efficiency, control, and production arguments from designers who could propose solutions for redesigning products, their branding, their promotion, and their point of sale. This period gave birth to the often repeated phrase of industrial designers as professionals capable of designing at all scales, from a toothpick to a city. Loewy's life and work are worth recounting briefly here to understand his rise and the creation of what John Wall, in his recent book, Streamliner, has called the Loewy brand. Born in France in 1893, Loewy completed basic engineering studies before serving in the French army during the First World War. After the war, Loewy followed his older brothers to the United States, arriving in New York in 1919 with a basic grasp of English, but starting out in illustration, providing drawings for department store advertisements, and moving on to general advertising. Because many documents from Loewy's early life have not survived, and Loewy constantly edited and revised his life story, How precisely Loewy made the shift into industrial design has always been a bit unclear, but in 1929, Loewy took on what he considered to be one of his earliest projects, the redesign of the Gestetner mimeograph. 2 years later, he married Jean Thompson, a French-speaking American who played a large role in establishing personal contacts and socializing and meeting with potential clients. During the 1930s, Loewy obtained work for such companies as the Hub Motor Company, Westinghouse, Greyhound, and Sears Roebuck, famously redesigning their cold spot refrigerator. His transportation design work also took off with projects for steamship companies and the S1 locomotive and other trains for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Loewy received positive publicity when he was included in a Fortune magazine article in 1934 on industrial design. He participated in the Metropolitan Museum exhibition that I showed you earlier, and Chrysler hired him to work on their building in the 1939-40 World's Fair in New York. This growth allowed him to hire his first true employee in 1934, and that was A. Baker Barnhart, an architectural engineering graduate with experience in transportation design. Commissions for store interiors and complete store designs prompted Loewy to hire William Snaith in 1936. And then a key turning point in Loewy's career occurred in 1940 when he hired the publicist Elizabeth, known as Betty, Reese. And he met her through his World's Fair work. Reese later remarked that Loewy actively embraced the value of publicity for himself and his office by posing for numerous photographs, speaking to reporters on radio, and later on television. These public relations efforts made him into an identifiable figure, creating what Reese called, quote, the Loewy legend. Loewy's office, and that's World's Fair work, sorry, right here, and that's Loewy in that photograph with one of the workers up there. Loewy's office expanded in the 1940s, working for clients like Lucky Strike, Studebaker, and International Harvester. By 1944, the scope of his office work grew so varied that he established the firm as Raymond Loewy Associates, a partnership of 5. So himself, William Snaith, Jean Thompson, A. Baker Barnhart, and business manager John Breen. And here they all are admiring one of these architectural models in the office. Loewy's output in the 1940s was aided tremendously by Reese's canny publicity. In 1949, Loewy obtained what Molly Heinz calls a triumphal PR trifecta. He was featured in no less than 3 major high-circulation mainstream magazines. So moving from our left-hand side here, the October 1949 cover of Time magazine, surrounded by a halo of his office's creative work, Life magazine in a lengthy article titled The Great Packager, and a few months later in Reader's Digest magazine. This visibility was priceless. These articles and others discussed his clients and work, but they also heavily emphasized his lifestyle, his houses, and his appearance, as you see here, essentially fashioning him into a design celebrity. In 1951, Simon & Schuster published Raymond Loewy's book, Never Leave Well Enough Alone, subtitled The Personal Record of an Industrial Designer, which was subsequently translated into multiple languages. This book, which some think may have been partly ghostwritten by Betty Reese, is at times a chatty review of his life and career. And while one of its aims was certainly self-promotion, Loewy offered a unique account of a relatively new profession that greatly impacted the pre- and post-World War II consumer landscape. By the 1950s, Loewy's office was at the height of its powers. Loewy led a busy life with his second wife, Viola Erickson, reopening his London office in 1947 and setting up a design office in Paris. By the mid-1950s, the firm had more than 200 employees, satellite offices in Los Angeles, Chicago, and South Bend, Indiana. It operated as a dynamic consultancy to many manufacturers and producers with divisions for product and packaging design, transportation, and store planning and design. At the New York office, Loewy selectively focused on projects that appealed to him, often involving vehicles or high-profile clients, while other projects, especially those focusing on retail architecture and store design, were controlled by Snaith and his expanding division, a practice that would continue well into the 1960s. In Loewy's own account of his life, and as Reese continued to promote through public relations material, Loewy was the Frenchman who came to America and impressed clients and the press with his desire to raise the bar for design while projecting an image of stylish flair and European sophistication. Snaith, on the other hand, was the American who went to France and returned to fashion a career as a bold businessman and design workhorse. Snaith was born in Brooklyn in 1908 and admitted later in life that he was not much of a student in high school. He referred to himself as a juvenile delinquent. Snaith took a job with a lithographer and became interested in art, managed to get enough credits through night school to study architecture for 2 years. To pay his way, Snaith took drafting jobs with architects. He went to Paris in 1931 after being encouraged to apply for a Whitney Warren scholarship, studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, and also in the fine arts program for Americans at Fontainebleau. And this is one of his paintings from the 1940s. Returning to New York in 1932, Snaith worked as an architectural draftsman until finding a job with a fashionable interior designer, Elsie DeWolf, before landing in Loewy's office. Once there, Snaith's ascent was steady. Loewy, who lacked architectural training, relied on Snaith's experience to design store interiors, moving him to the position of Director of Retail Design and Planning in 1940. Snaith's creative gifts and effective approach to business were significant enough for Loewy to name him a partner in 1944. And in 1956, Snaith became a managing partner, and he bought out the interests of the other partners in order to do this. In 1961, Snaith became president of the newly renamed office of Raymond Loewy, William Snaith. And you see the two of them there from about 1963. And Loewy took on the job as chairman of the board. Snaith retained this position until his unexpected death in 1974, his passing marked by an obituary in the New York Times and other publications. Snaith's work in the store planning and architecture division generated a very important revenue stream for the office. Few firms at this time specialized in retail, design, and architecture, and as Snaith later noted, I had a feeling that merchandise had very little intrinsic value and that it needed to be supported by some other agency, the ambiance, the atmosphere, the so on. So in other words, the physical store environment inside and out. One of his first large retail clients was Lord & Taylor, the renowned New York City department store. The office remodeled the main Fifth Avenue store in the late 1930s, but then under the direction of Lord & Taylor's Dorothy Shaver, they embarked on an extensive new modern branch store program. With Snaith's supervision, the first Manhattan branch store opened in 1941 on Long Island, and the division continued to work through the next 2 decades for Lord & Taylor, creating an effective identity for their branch stores in many suburban communities. In 1944, based on the strength of his design work for the 1941 Manhasset branch, you see here in architectural record, Snaith was entrusted with a broad study, and that study was called Implementing Tomorrow. It was on the needs of the post-World War II store for the Associated Merchandising Corporation conglomerate of retailers. Ken White, who worked in Snaith's division in the 1940s and later opened his own specialized store design office, told me that he considered this study one of the most important department store design documents ever created. It promoted such things as automation in the store to reduce operating costs, stock and merchandise stored efficiently on-site behind the scenes for more direct selling rather than off-site, and then thematic divisions for goods by using such categories as size shops, juniors, misses, children's, collegians, etc. When the Foley department store opened in Houston and was built in 1947, Snaith had an opportunity to bring many of these concepts to reality when Loewy's firm was hired. The store included an automated system of operations with a series of chutes and conveyors, allowing a purchase made on upper floors to be wrapped, placed on a spiral chute leading to a central conveyor system, passing under the street into the garage building where staff sorted them for delivery or pickup by shoppers in their cars. Pretty nifty. Snaith's success led to further commissions with many other retailers, and that includes Filings, Rich's, Gimbel's, and later on supermarkets as well. His division also attracted a large number of talented architects to the firm, eager to explore this new world of design, and that includes Andrew Geller, Almond Fordyce, Justin Fabricius, Maury Clay, whole group of designers. By the mid-1950s, Loewy's day-to-day engagement with the office decreased, and the work was increasingly delegated. Snaith's professional expertise, therefore, became even more essential for the firm's profile. But from the 1940s onward, Snaith was active in discussing design issues with his writing appearing in professional publications. Fellow design professionals and retailers recognized his knowledge and skill in the field of retail architecture. In a 1956 address to the American Society of Industrial Designers, Snaith outlined the interrelationship between the professions of architecture and industrial design and their ability to merge their skills to offer a comprehensive level of service in the retail sector. In the April 1959 issue of Architectural Record, Snaith drew on 2 decades of study and experience in merchandising and store design, writing an article, Architecture in the Community of Retailing, and that outlined the main factors for store design success. And he listed them and explained them as location, use of site, interior relationships of operating elements, type of merchandise, and exterior and interior atmosphere to convey store character. So Snaith indeed achieved a rare feat at the time by interweaving the practice of industrial design with architecture. And this prompted William Henry to single out Loewy's office as a leader in his 1959 article called Where Two Professions Meet, They Overlap. And he noted that industrial design firms were, quote, unhampered by the strict definitions of the architectural profession. And this is because they embraced the opportunity to offer full-service design. So certainly without Snaith, Loewy's firm would never have been able to carve a path into this world of architecture. As Snaith's professional expertise became central to the firm's success, his own image and brand were also celebrated. Crafted undoubtedly by Betty Reese to show his versatility, it echoes the pervasive branding of Loewy's name and face from the 1940s onward. Both men were presented as a type of artistically talented white male with business savvy along with passions. Cars for Loewy, sailboats for Snaith. Snaith often repeated that he felt an industrial designer, quote, is the 20th century's Renaissance man, the only professional who had indicated either the willingness or ability to tackle a modern problem in a modern way. Snaith was indeed living an energetic life as a designer, artist, writer, and competitive sailor, with Industrial Design magazine writing in 1959 that the variety of services offered by Loewy's office, quote, is perhaps a professional manifestation of the personality of Snaith. He even appeared as the subject of a beer advertisement in 1962. I just love this ad. It prominently depicts him in this promotion for Ballantine Ale. And it says, who is the ale man? Well, it's William Snaith, champion yachtsman, famous industrial designer. Ale man. It's a man's world on Bill Snaith's racing yawl. Figure 03. He continued to paint and exhibit his work throughout his life, and he wrote books on modern art along with books on sailing and racing. And his life, both as a sportsman and a designer, became the subject of articles like, again, great title here, Sports Illustrated portrayed him as the salty sailor of Park Avenue. All of this press was compiled into a massive scrapbook of publicity maintained by Reese, and there's this entire volume that was dedicated solely to Snaith, so she was very good at getting him placed in these publications. When Snaith died unexpectedly in 1974, the New York office was thrown into turmoil. Although Loewy worked on projects like the Avanti sports car and did corporate work for Shell Oil, the late 1960s and early 1970s were challenging. Corporations increasingly hired in-house industrial designers, and the economic downturn of the early 1970s strained the office's ability to continue at the level it had previously enjoyed. Despite Loewy's efforts to re-engage with the office after Snaith's death and merge the New York, Paris, and London offices in 1975 into Raymond Loewy International, Loewy lacked the energy of his younger years to keep everything afloat. And by 1976, he sold his shares in the business. By 1977, that business was bankrupt. Conscious of securing his place in the history of industrial design, Loewy took some extraordinary steps after 1974, partially eroding the contributions of Snaith and others to the success of his firm. In his 1951 book, Loewy directly named Snaith and other colleagues and employees, commenting on their skills and contributions. But by the 1970s, things changed, and Loewy was not as generous. Loewy was the subject of a 1975 exhibition at the Renwick Gallery of the Smithsonian Museum, where the focus was clearly on him. And here he is on the right side at the reception. And this on the left, they're trying to get the Avanti in sideways into the gallery. I just love that photo. Really great. The focus was clearly on him. Faced with financial difficulties, Loewy began to sell lithographs of his designs. Historian Jeffrey Michael remarked that the longer Loewy lived, the less credit he gave other industrial design pioneers like Walter Dorwin Teague, Norman Bell Geddes, and so on. I believe this statement can also be applied to those in his own office, as was certainly the case with Snaith. When Loewy's 1979 book, Raymond Loewy, Industrial Design, appeared, there was a stark difference in both the tone and content from his 1951 book. The 1979 book was filled with color photographs and reproductions of the firm's work, and the content was heavily tilted toward automotive and transportation designs, along with Loewy's more recent work. It included a lengthy interview with Loewy and featured little on store planning and architecture, and very brief mention of Snaith or Loewy's other partners and collaborators. Loewy's statements and interviews in the 1970s were sometimes repeated endlessly in publications about his career without much fact-checking, I might add. Complicating this history was the fact that many development drawings from the 1930s through the early 1960s were not saved in the office. The office practice was for Loewy's stylized signature to be placed on nearly every final drawing, reinforcing the myth that Loewy's hand had developed each design and touched each sheet of paper. After Loewy's death in 1986, Betty Reese stated, "In the final analysis, Loewy really wasn't capable of sharing the limelight. Even when he had supposedly retired and turned the business over to Bill Snaith, he simply refused to give up the publicity. Snaith was a genius in his own right who had perfected the design of store planning. He could squeeze the most dollars per square inch of retail space." Jay Doblin, who worked for Loewy from 1942 to 1956 in marketing design, supported this well-known fact among the Loewy colleagues, remarking after Loewy's death, and I quote from Jay Doblin, "I never got any credit for anything I did at Raymond Loewy, nor did anybody else. But I didn't care. The man was the greatest salesman to ever hit the design business. He made it possible for us to work on marvelous accounts, learning, having fun, and getting paid for it. That's why none of us resented him grabbing 100% of the credit." So understanding the contributions by various individual designers in Loewy's office, therefore, is detective work and a process of discovery by following multiple threads. Various parts of Loewy's project archive exist in different locations, some in fragmentary form, with uneven levels of documentation, especially from the period between 1930 and 1960. So although one of my aims today is to revive interest in William Snaith and his work, my larger goal is to remind us, as many architectural and design historians have recently, to explore the issue of collaboration in design practice. Snaith's legacy suffered under the weight of what Loewy constructed. It cautions us all to search for the more complex histories of collaboration. We need to keep asking who helped design, what roles did people play, who was excluded, who gets remembered, and why. Casting a more critical eye over autobiographies, questioning the self-presentation of individual practitioners, particularly in this age of hyper-branding and social media, and probing primary sources and archives more deeply, as Richard told us to do, will yield more complete stories of the many compelling architecture and design subjects we study. Thank you. Thank you, Richard.
How's everyone doing? Need to stretch a little. Our next speaker is one from my era, a little younger, I'll give her that. Bridget Manley, who is principal of Architecture Plus or and? Plus History, LLC in San Francisco. She manages this San Francisco-based architectural history and historic preservation consultancy. She's really the best in San Francisco. She's contributed to a wide range of award-winning projects, including significant sites in Western national and state parks, as well as historic campus settings. She has served as president of the San Francisco Landmarks Preservation Advisory Board, is a former board member of the Society of Architectural Historians, and has participated in the School of Architecture's Dean's Advisory Board. Today she is going to speak to us about John Carl Warnke and the Shadow of the Eternal Flame. Bridget.
All right, now I have to figure out how to do this. Let's see. It's black. What do I do? There we go. Sorry. Challenging. Okay, well, I'll just follow on. Christine, did you know that John Carl Warneke was involved in the renovation of the Renwick? Right about that same time. So probably nobody knew that. So anyway, thank you for the segue. I appreciate that. Okay, make sure everybody can hear me. John Carl Warneke designed one of the United States' most visited presidential monuments, John F. Kennedy's Eternal Flame at Arlington National Cemetery. Given the fact that Americans are fascinated with everything Kennedy, all things Camelot, and the lasting influence of this clan, dubbed America's royal family, why isn't Jack Warneke more of a household name? Is he overshadowed by the eternal flame of his own making? I contend that Warneke's frequent reliance on a contextual design approach contributes to his recession into the background of post-war modernism. The March 1960 architectural record highlighted 3 of Warneke's California projects: a large student housing complex at UC Berkeley, won through a competition and sited almost immediately adjacent to Bernard Maybach's First Church of Christ Scientist; a project at Warneke's alma mater, steps from Shepley-Rutan and Coolidge's Stanford Quad, with the article proclaiming, quote, "The design approach successfully combines a conscious recall of certain traditional elements of the earlier campus buildings and a strong expression of contemporary design." Also featured were Warneke's additions to Asilomar in Pacific Grove, nestled next to Julia Morgan's earlier buildings. Of the architect's work, the author opined, quote, "The 12 years since he opened his office, Warneke has sharpened the focus of his design philosophy, but he has not changed it. He seeks to develop an approach to architecture, not a style." That same architectural record exemplified projects by a who's who of the architectural establishment, including Saarinen's design for the Dulles Airport, touted as, quote, "a new airport for jets." A Dallas, Texas theater by Wright, completed posthumously, and a residential project by Neutra in the California desert. These architects are somewhat familiar to us and to many Americans. However, if you asked most Americans who the man listening intently to Jackie Kennedy is in this photograph, most would not have a clue. Yes, there was a romance, and we will come back to that later. No monograph promoting Warneke's contribution to American modernism has been penned. At his death in 2010, there were rumors of an incomplete memoir. His archive is intact and housed at his Sonoma Ranch. Warneke's collective portfolio and his fascinating view into one of the country's greatest tragedies is more than deserving of a published retrospective. Warneke developed an interest in designing within a contextual framework early in his career, and this vocabulary carried through to his many built projects. Lafayette Square, where he first interacted with Jackie Kennedy, is often held up as a prime example of his contextualism. Given the longevity of his career, I'll provide first a glimpse of his life and his contextual methods, then return to the question of why Warneke seems to have disappeared from the post-war architectural narrative. To conjure a music industry analogy, I don't believe he was a one-hit wonder. Thank you, Jeff Tillman. Raised in Oakland, California, Warneke's father, Carl Ingemar Warneke, was an École-trained architect who worked for both Bernard Maybach and Arthur Brown Jr. before establishing his own firm. One of the elder Warneke's early projects was assisting Bakewell and Brown with this building, San Francisco City Hall. The younger Warneke graduated from Stanford in 1941 and also briefly worked for Brown, a relationship likely facilitated through his father. With a long history of Stanford work, Brown was designing the iconic Hoover Tower during the junior Warneke's short tenure in his office. A football injury sustained during a Rose Bowl winning season at Stanford ensured that Warneke did not serve in the armed forces. As World War II raged, Warneke traveled east studying with Gropius at Harvard, completing his degree by 1942. Returning west, Warneke contributed to the needed home front housing in Richmond, California. He joined his father's practice, remaining there until the war finally ground to a halt. By 1947, Warneke had established his own firm while also engaging in projects with his father under the moniker Warneke and Warneke. In June 1948, Warneke and his first wife, Grace Cushing, boarded the Matson Line's Laura Line to Hawaii, returning a month later via United Airlines. The trip and the place had a deep impact on him. Warneke's California work over the next 10 years, particularly his hospitality projects, reflected his acquired appreciation of Hawaii. He also pursued work in the new state, winning several high-profile commissions. This Hawaiian infusion is apparent and influence is apparent in his Monterey, California project, which was featured in a September 1957 architectural record article dramatically titled "Man Made the Buildings." Situated adjacent to a golf course with views to the Monterey Bay, the Mark Thomas Inn was a collaboration with landscape architect Lawrence Halprin. Designed around a series of pavilions intended to meld into the natural surroundings, the article declared, quote, "The site was developed to fit the buildings, the roads, and the parking areas into the open spaces between the old oak trees," end quote. The use of low-slung roofs with outrigger rafter tails and the typical Hawaiian lanai are reflective of his growing appreciation and incorporation of island elements in his designs. Several years previous, in 1951, Warneke completed the Mira Vista School in Richmond, California, that same community where he completed the war housing project. In 1960, the AIA held its convention in San Francisco, and the local chapter produced a truly exceptional guidebook. Of Warneke's Richmond School, the authors noted, quote, "Beautiful setting and long, linked gable roofs make this famous school one of the most inviting in the area," end quote. So just 9 years after winning this project, it was deemed famous by these AIA guidebook writers. Several successful school projects led to a commission not in California but Columbus, Indiana. Recommended by Saarinen to participate in an experimental design program, Warneke was drawn to the effort's cooperative, community-based design approach. He later recalled, quote, "The dominant characteristics of southern Indiana is the flat terrain, a horizontal theme accentuated by tall Victorian houses, barns, and silos, with picturesque groves of trees. The school design is based on the creation of a similar grouping of masses and spaces," end quote. Warneke's pointed interest in contextual design was beginning to be commonly understood in critical reviews of his work. Similarly, his first major international commission included an acknowledgement of local building and cultural traditions. Selected in 1956 for a major post-World War II expansion of the American diplomatic program through a worldwide embassy building campaign, Warneke was tapped to design the embassy in Bangkok, Thailand. While referencing the site's context and regional traditions was delineated in the State Department's program, Warneke seems to have taken the requirement to a higher degree of consideration. During his research excursion to Thailand, he found an appreciation for the waterways, or the canals, equating them to Venice's system, saying, quote, "On account of the penetration of water throughout the city, Bangkok is alive with reflections. All the color and beauty of the architecture are twice present. The sensitive use of water as a design element in architecture has a long-established tradition locally. Angkor Wat is mirrored in a broad moat," end quote. Despite his careful study of the local traditions, the building was never realized. Perhaps it was too contrived or did not convey the United States Cold War dominance forcefully enough. In The Architecture of Diplomacy, Jane Loeffler recounted that Warneke confessed to her that he had seen The King and I, and may have had preconceived notions of Thailand. Indeed, he wrote later that he had dined with the production's Princess Inspiration and her 22 children during his visit. Aware of the publicity of the Thai Embassy project and being familiar with the nearby Mark Thomas Inn, California State Parks engaged Warneke to develop a master plan for Asilomar in 1958. Nestled amongst the dunes and Monterey pines, Warneke inherited a site of natural beauty with stunning ocean views and a significant collection of Julia Morgan buildings. Originally a YWCA camp, the Y gifted the site to the state when it could no longer afford its maintenance. Morgan's small-scale buildings placed on hardy stone foundations reflected the First Bay tradition, a locally infused, melded version of the arts and crafts and shingle styles. Very clearly spelling out his design criteria, Warneke wrote that, quote, "It is important that any additions to the building group be accomplished without destroying the easy relationship of the buildings to the land. The site should not become crowded," end quote. That same March 1960 architectural record, which I showed you earlier, featured images of Warneke's project at Asilomar. The article stated, quote, "Inherent in the design's challenge is the need for a sympathetic perception of the environmental relationships of the site. The natural setting has a serene beauty for which the Monterey Peninsula is noted. The existing buildings, designed with a strong affinity for the place by the pioneer woman architect Julia Morgan, are still in use. The low lines, simple details, and sensitive use of the site without disturbing sand or trees give the new buildings an unaffected serenity altogether appropriate." And so Julia Morgan died in 1959, so this is a year later that he's kind of building and designing these additions to her site. Warneke's work at Asilomar represents the best of an evolving regional architecture that embraced the use of natural materials while creating a modern aesthetic. Here, his jewel box additions to Morgan's dining hall contrast the solid stone piers and the heavy roof overhang with transparent glass instead of shingled walls. Simultaneously during this period, Warneke was embroiled in an urban counterpart to his contextualism quandary that he had mastered at Asilomar. In 1961, President Kennedy, prodded by his wife, interjected himself into the planning for new government buildings adjacent to Lafayette Square, near the White House. Mrs. Kennedy, with reason, objected to the demolition of the historic federal period row houses facing the square. The president, familiar with Warneke and his work, asked the architect if he had a better solution. His subsequent study proposed retaining the older buildings and employing them as gateways to larger, modern red brick office buildings around a series of courtyards. Mrs. Kennedy was thrilled, understanding that most of Warneke's contemporaries would not have made the effort to incorporate the historic structures. However, the events of November 1963 soon overshadowed the Lafayette Square problem and Warneke's solution. After the assassination, Jackie Kennedy, under intense public scrutiny during a period of extreme national mourning, turned to Warneke to design a final resting place for her murdered husband. In the days immediately following his death, Mrs. Kennedy advocated for the president's burial at Arlington rather than in Massachusetts, and introduced the idea of an eternal flame. Perhaps Mrs. Kennedy called on Warneke because she knew him and she felt comfortable with him. She also likely comprehended his interest in and appreciation of history. By siting Kennedy's permanent interment on a hillside below the historic Lee family Arlington house, the location also offered expansive views of Washington's collection of presidential monuments. Warneke advocated a simple, restrained scheme that retained the eternal flame lit during the first interment ceremony. He affirmed, quote, "This particular hillside, this flame, this man, at this point in history, must be synthesized in one statement that has a distinctive character of its own. We must avoid adding elements that in later decades might become superficial and detract from the deeds of the man," end quote. In correspondence with Mrs. Kennedy explaining his design, Warneke wrote that the flame was stronger than any structure or sculpture that might be added to it. While the president's grave was intentionally understated, Mrs. Kennedy understood the design would create a powerful visitor experience. Crafting a plan that allowed visitors to amble along a curved path, Warneke inserted a plaza at the apex of this ambulatory, fronting the grave site where the eternal flame could be viewed. A low granite wall inscribed with his most inspiring words rimmed the plaza. As the design evolved, Warneke sought counsel from other designers, but the final outcome is fully attributed to him, with input and approval from Mrs. Kennedy. There's that wall. Throughout this national turmoil and his attention to Mrs. Kennedy's desires for her husband's memorial, Warneke was also overseeing a new governmental complex for the country's newest state, Hawaii. Arguably the second most recognizable of his collective works, Warneke was tasked with fitting a monumental building into a parcel that included the a Victorian-era Hawaiian palace. Embarking on a similar design process that he had employed for the Thai Embassy project, Warneke's research and design approach resulted in a building that literally resembles a volcano. The courtyard framed the mouth of the crater and with open air circulation providing access to offices and legislative chambers. The chamber walls emulated a volcano's sweeping interior. And in plan, these ovals flow outward like oozing lava. With this commission, Warneke was spending considerable time in Hawaii. Simultaneously, his relationship with Jackie Kennedy had graduated from friend, confidant, and client into a full-fledged romance. In June 1966, Jackie and her children joined him in Hawaii, where the two talked seriously about marriage. Realistically, however, Warneke's project commitments, extensive travel, the ups and downs of the architecture world meant that he could not offer the widowed First Lady the stability and the security that she sought. We all know what happened next. Increasingly busy managing a practice with a ballooning staff with multiple offices in San Francisco, Washington, Honolulu, and Sonoma, Warneke secured several significant commissions throughout the 1960s. In 1967, his firm's revenue was second only to Edward Durrell Stone. By 1970, he had a wide range of award-winning projects under his belt. Complementing the projects already discussed, Warneke had designed the Oakland Airport Terminal, a campus master plan for the Naval Academy at Annapolis, significant Stanford projects, San Francisco Federal Building, multiple large housing and hospitality projects both in California and Hawaii, and a new library at Georgetown. This commission, which illustrates his foray into brutalism, was not without certain controversies. Nonetheless, the project aptly yet abstractly referenced the established university architecture, including its famous spires. While superseding an earlier library, true to Warneke's appreciation of history and place, the new library did not result in the demolition of the older building. His other significant project of this era included selection as the prime architect to lead a master plan for a new campus at the University of California to be located at Santa Cruz. Assembling a group of California designers, Warneke's team was charged with planning a campus, UC's first based on the Oxford model, to be set on a dramatic plateau with significant and magnificent ocean views. The site was a gift to the Regents and once housed limestone quarries, a lime production facility, and a cattle ranch. Warneke's plan retained the historic remnants emblematic of the site's agricultural and industrial past, employing them to frame the campus entry. Warneke and landscape architect Thomas Church preserved the great meadows and purposefully clustered individual buildings within the existing tree canopy. The Regents also commissioned Warneke to design the main library for the campus. He skillfully crafted a building that would harmonize and blend with the surrounding redwood forest. The work, the travel, and the constant crunch of deadlines had contributed to the dissolution of his first marriage. After his romance with Mrs. Kennedy fizzled, Warneke married Grace Keenan, daughter of the diplomat George Keenan. His larger, high-profile commissions began to wane in the 1970s, and he retired to his Sonoma ranch in 1980. With this, we return to Warneke's place in post-war American modernism. Did he retire into obscurity? Is his work recognized or unknown? What of his contextualism? Is it important? Did it have a place in the post-war architectural psyche? Or are Warneke's projects truly in the shadow of Arlington, which ironically was not a building but an experienced landscape? If you look for Warneke's projects in key publications about modernism, his work is not present. This 1952 MoMA exhibit catalog built in the USA was published just as Warneke was breaking into the mainstream. However, it was Ernest Kump's school in San Jose, not Warneke's Mira Vista school, that was featured, although they were just 2 years apart. Other examples, like this one by Eric Mendelsohn, also represented Northern California. Further, we don't see Warneke having a residential portfolio. That was never his interest. Thus, he's not in Architecture's Case Study Houses program, despite an almost exclusive reliance on California architects. Additionally, he's not present in the Mission 66 portfolio of the National Park Service, although many of his contemporaries were practicing on this national initiative. Similarly, an exhibit organized by David Gebhardt and Susan King titled A View of California Architecture, 1960 to 1976, did not include a single Warneke project, yet these years represent the height of his practice. Admittedly, this exhibit was POMO heavy, including Charles Moore's Kresge College, a project that fulfilled fulfilled College 6 in Warneke's earlier master plan for the UC Santa Cruz campus. Well, I'm going to get my best Richard in here. Well, I had to get this in here somehow. Of this esteemed group, several who were born just a year or two within Warneke, he's not invited. He's not present, and certainly he's at this point sort of receded from the architectural world. No major published architectural survey includes a Warneke building. Nor was Warneke mentioned in a certain someone's lecture about post-war modernism, or at least as far as I remember. Peter Blake, the longtime editor at Architectural Forum, ruminating in a 1975 article delineating Warneke's contributions, stated, quote, "The very nature of a big architectural office encourages a certain standardization in approach and detail, and the work of even the best of them is usually predictable. Warneke's work is not. His buildings on the West Coast are closely attuned to a vernacular where he was born. His Capitol building for the new state of Hawaii is an attempt to pay homage to the distinctive cultural heritage of those islands. And his elementary school in Columbus, Indiana, was a conscious attempt to relate to the Midwestern landscape. Not many large architectural firms in the United States would spend time worrying about the special qualities of the San Francisco Bay region, the cultural heritage of the Hawaiian Islands, or the landscape of southern Indiana. Warneke's firm did." To Mr. Blake's astute observations, which do not mention the project at Arlington, I'll add that my immersion into Warneke's career has convinced me that his larger portfolio is rather unjustly overshadowed by one project. Warneke's understanding of and sensitivity to both the natural and historic context should make him more of a celebrated American mid-century architect. I would argue that his master plan for UC Santa Cruz laid the groundwork for an absolutely stunning array of brilliantly designed modern college groupings unparalleled on any other American campus. His work at Asilomar celebrated rather than diminished the work of Julia Morgan. His Hawaii State Capitol melded natural, geological, and cultural references specific to the place into a fully modern structure. Even when he dabbled in brutalism as at the Georgetown Library, he was not brutal enough to erase an earlier campus building. In conclusion, John Carl Warneke's reliance on a contextual approach to design and his interest in the history and culture that shaped and informed each site should justify why we are interested in his work today, not provide an excuse to render him forgettable.
Brava. And last but not least, may we have a drum roll? Dale Allen Geyer is a professor and associate chair of architecture at Lawrence Technological University. Dr. Geyer's research focuses on 19th and 20th century architecture, particularly the intersections of architecture, education, and society. He's published numerous books and articles, including The Chicago Schoolhouse, 1856 to 2006, High School Architecture and Educational Reform, The Schoolroom, A Social History of Teaching and Learning, Minoru Yamasaki, Humanist Architecture for a Modernist World, and Frank Lloyd Wright's Florida Southern College. Today, he will be speaking to us about education as family business, the three families behind the Crow Island School.
Thank you. Let's see what. Oops. I'm the only thing standing between you and the first break, and I know what that means. So I will step on the gas a little bit here. And actually, the title's a bit misleading. I'm only going to be able to talk about two education families in 20 minutes, so I'll do my best to edit on the fly. I want to thank everybody who's responsible for giving me the opportunity to be here. And if I start to talk too fast, just, Jan, raise your hand. I know what that means. I want to thank Richard, too, for teaching me how to be an architectural historian. Okay, so there are three main protagonists in the story of the design of Crow Island School in Winnetka, Illinois, America's most famous, architecturally famous school building. Each of these individuals came from families involved with education. One was a progressive educator, soon to become world famous, whose mother was a respected education writer. Another was a young architect, eventually to become the head of a world famous firm, whose father was one of the most respected school architects in America, and whose mother wrote and illustrated children's books. The third man was an even younger architect, eventually to become world famous, whose father was an internationally renowned architect who taught design for nearly 2 decades and created 2 of the most highly regarded American schools of the 1920s. The educator was Carlton Washburn. The architect was Larry Perkins, and the younger architect was Eero Saarinen. The point of this paper is to use my Wilsonian perspective to dig deeper into these personalities, to seek clues to Crow Island's design. In it, I'll discuss how the educational backgrounds of these key players influenced this seminal school building. My point is that these men appreciated education in a different way than most other people because of their personal experiences. Washburn once wrote about his family's obsession with education, quote, "All my life I heard new ideas in education discussed around the dinner table and fireside," end quote. I know exactly what Carlton Washburn meant and how it feels to be in such an environment. My mother was an elementary school teacher, and my father was a social studies teacher who became a middle school principal. Every night at dinner, they talked about education. Schools, teachers, administrators, techniques, theories, etc. In my case, growing up in that way led to a lifelong passion for educational issues, although I didn't realize it back then. And not surprisingly, I ended up in academia. I can only begin to sketch out a story in the short time available today, but my current research involves thinking about how the unique insights gained from being raised in education-oriented households influenced these men, as exemplified by the Crow Island School. For these 3 individuals, education was a family business, and that affected their attitude towards school design. In my research, I've learned quite a bit about these 3 incredible families, and this morning I'll share very briefly a little bit of that knowledge. And I apologize beforehand for some of these images, but it's all I could find. Carlton Washburn said that his mother, quote, had been deeply interested in education, had written and lectured on child study, and had lectured in a kindergarten training college, end quote. This description truly understates the remarkable life of Marion Foster Washburn. She was born in Northampton, Massachusetts in 1863 and raised in Philadelphia in a comfortable home. She married in the mid-1880s and moved to Chicago. Following the birth of her 2 sons, Norman and Carlton, in a 3-year period, she enrolled in a mother's course at the Chicago Kindergarten College, seeking information on how to raise her boys. When her daughter Dorothea arrived a year later, Marion felt overwhelmed. She made the momentous decision to take the full kindergarten training course at the Frabel Association Training School. Within 2 years, Marion was writing a newspaper column on education and speaking at the International Congress of Education at the World's Columbian Exposition. At some point, she became friends with progressive education pioneers Francis Wayland Parker and John Dewey. Parker ran the Cook County Normal School, the only institution for training elementary school teachers in Chicago. He asked Marion to become a faculty-parent liaison, and she quickly evolved into much more than that, moving deeper into the city's circle of extraordinary educators. Marion began to host a Sunday evening gathering of these leaders, including figures like Parker, University of Chicago President William Rainey Harper, and Jane Addams. By the time Carlton Washburn was 10, his mother was editing magazines and writing articles in successful books of children's stories, essays, fiction, and child development, in addition to raising her family. Marion's 1907 book, The Mother's Yearbook, was an early example of the practical child-rearing genre that would become so popular after World War II. Later came the more extensive Study of Child Life in 1925, a thick tome intended by Marion as a series of lessons on topics ranging from infants' mental and physical development to how to teach youngsters about religion, finances, and art. At the end of the book was an exam to make sure readers made the most of the material. Later in her eventful life, Marion moved to California and divorced, remarried, edited a socialist magazine, became a socialist, ran for state office on a ticket with Upton Sinclair and lost, and wrote a final book about Estonia on the eve of its usurpation by the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And if I could just spend 20 minutes talking about Marion, I would. She's great. Her son Carlton became a teacher after graduating from Stanford University and found himself employing techniques inspired by his mother's work and his own personal journey through progressive schools. After just a few years of experience, Washburn became the superintendent of the Winnetka, Illinois Public Schools. Winnetka was a village of slightly over 12,000, located north of Chicago on Lake Michigan. He was only 29 years old. Washburn was truly a progressive educator, interested, like his mother, in educating the whole child, and eager to implement some of the ideas he learned at the San Francisco State Normal School, the most progressive teacher training institution in the country. Washburn devised and implemented the Winnetka Plan, a system copied around the world in future years. Its objectives were twofold: to allow children to develop at their own pace via individualized instruction, and to eliminate the memorization-based recitation method, which had dominated education for centuries. When the Winnetka Board of Education voted to add a new elementary school in the 1920s, Washburn began to think about how to translate his unique curricular ideas into architectural form and space. But the Great Depression postponed any further action until 1937. When the project was revived and a location found, the board created a committee to work with Washburn to find the right architect. Things weren't going well in that regard when Washburn received a young architect named Lawrence Bradford Perkins in his office. Larry Perkins was born in Evanston, Illinois, the youngest child and only son of Dwight and Lucy Perkins. Dwight Perkins had been raised by a single mother after his lawyer father died when Dwight was 3. His mother Marion became a social reformer with connections to Jane Addams, and his aunt Clara Mahoney was an elementary school principal. Clara's daughter, Dwight's first cousin, Marion, would follow him to the architecture program at MIT a few years later down the line. Dwight eventually became board architect for the Chicago Public Schools, designing over 40 school buildings for the city in a 5-year span, followed by a long and successful career as a nationally renowned school architect. He died in the fall of 1941 while on a sketching trip to New Mexico, a little over a year after his son Larry's Crow Island School opened. In 1891, Dwight had married Lucy Adeline Fitch of Maples, Indiana. Lucy was the daughter of New Englanders Appleton and Elizabeth Fitch. Her father had studied education at Amherst College and held posts as an elementary school principal and a high school teacher before the Civil War. After being discharged from the military for health reasons, he entered the barrel-making business and never returned to education, although he homeschooled Lucy and her sisters. Lucy showed artistic talent from an early age. After high school, she moved to Boston to study illustration at the Museum of Fine Arts School. Following graduation and brief jobs as a book illustrator and a teaching assistant, Lucy married Dwight Perkins and moved to Evanston, Illinois. Their first child, Eleanor, came shortly thereafter, and in 1907, she gave birth to Larry. Lucy had been working as a writer to help supplement family income. Neither of her first 2 books sold well, but in 1911, she published The Dutch Twins. The story, illustrated by Lucy, revealed some of the everyday lives of Kit and Kat, 5-year-old Dutch twins, giving readers glimpses of life in a different culture. The response to The Dutch Twins was so great that the publisher hired her to do a series. In the end, Lucy's 26 twins books, published between 1911 and 1938, 26 of them, sold over 2 million copies. Lucy intended these books to be educational and not mere entertainment. Her fictional twins were usually boy and girl siblings whose lives were depicted as accurately as possible, along with some legends and folklore. schools across the country employed the twins' books, and they would be translated into numerous languages. Most of Lucy's life after moving to Chicago involved a prolonged engagement with children and educational issues. When her health deteriorated due to coronary thrombosis, Lucy and Dwight moved to Pasadena, California, and she was still writing when she died of a heart attack in the spring of 1937, shortly before her son Larry would first hear about the new school proposed for Winnetka. Both Dwight and Lucy Perkins' children followed their parents' career paths. Daughter Eleanor became a writer and illustrator of children's books like her mother and wrote a story about her family. Son Larry turned to architecture, like his father, graduating from Cornell University in 1931. After working for his father and kicking around at some odd jobs, Larry and his college friend Philip Will formed Perkins and Will in 1935. The following year, they were joined by Todd Wheeler, a young University of Illinois graduate. Perkins, Wheeler, and Will had a few local housing commissions, but nothing spectacular. In 1937, Will designed and built a modernist house for himself in Winnetka, and that was the firm's major project to that point. When he heard of the public school project, Larry Perkins set up a meeting with Carlton Washburn to promote his fledgling firm, despite their lack of built work, probably capitalizing on the fact that Washburn knew his mother and sister as writers. Washburn politely listened to Larry's sales pitch, but was hindered by his own unfocused ideas. According to Perkins, Washburn was dissatisfied by existing school designs and lamented, quote, "If we could get somebody like Saarinen, we wouldn't have this problem," end quote. Legend has it that in that instance, Perkins, whose family was friends with and once hosted Eliel Saarinen, boasted that he not only knew the famous architect, but could convince him to get involved. This was, as Larry later admitted, an outrageous and shameless bluff. But it worked. Washburn reacted enthusiastically and agreed to allow Perkins to be involved with this new school design if Saarinen collaborated. Fortunately, Saarinen was receptive when Perkins cold called him to explain the opportunity. By December 1937, the Board of Education approved the employment of Eliel Saarinen and Perkins, Wheeler, and Will for its newest elementary school. And I think we all know who Eliel Saarinen is, and I'm going to skim a little bit because the three education family thing doesn't quite work. It sort of works with the Saarinens, but it works much better with the Perkinses and the Washburns. So to make a long story short, Eliel Saarinen is also from an educational family in his own way. Eliel headed the architecture department at Cranbrook for 18 years, was the dean of the Cranbrook Academy of Art, and wrote 2 books on architecture and urbanism. His wife, Loya, directed Cranbrook's weaving and textile design department for a decade. And Arrow even gave it a try. At the time of the Crow Island design, he was co-teaching a course on city planning with his father and was listed as a Cranbrook faculty member. He was later fired for a lack of attention. These 3 men, Carlton Washburn, Lawrence Perkins, and Eliel Saarinen, spearheaded the design of the Crow Island School. The school is recognized by both educators and architects as a milestone. For the educators, it physically embodied one of the most successful progressive educational experiments of the 20th century, while for the architects, it's revered as the first school building in America to be designed from the child's point of view. In 1955, the journal Architectural Record placed the Crow Island School in a tie for 12th in a ranking of the 100 most significant buildings of the past century. Not just schools, all buildings. And in 1990, Crow Island was named a National Historic Landmark by the National Park Service. To do justice to the Crow Island School, I'd need much more time than I have today, so I'll briefly summarize the highlights. Crow Island was the only school that Carlton Washburn was able to build during his tenure in Winnetka, which ended in 1943 when he enlisted in the service and ended up studying here at UVA. I've seen photographs of the group he was with. Although all of the village's schools followed the Winnetka Plan, only one was specifically designed for it. The evidence is mixed, but it appears that Perkins, Wheeler, and Will handled much of Crow Island's formal planning, including the individual classroom design. The Saarinen team, consisting of Eliel, his wife Loya, a weaver, his son Arrow, and Arrow's ceramicist fiancée Lillian Swan, developed the building's aesthetic program and had some say in the layout. Washburn confirmed this basic division of labor between the firms, but I have my own suspicions, and more about that in a few years. Three important innovations stand out among the Crow Island School's many remarkable features. The first dealt with the building's overall plan. It was one-storied where the standard American school was multi-storied, and it was asymmetrical and non-axial where they were formal and dominated by center and cross axes. The Crow Island classrooms were L-shaped instead of rectangular, and they ignored long-standing customs by placing windows in adjacent walls and locating toilets within the classroom rather than grouped together down the hallway. The designers integrated the messy workspaces accompanying elementary education into the classrooms. Crow Island's footprint formed a slightly straightened Z shape originally. Its interior space was zoned into separate areas for administration, communal activities, kindergarten and nursery, lower grades 1 and 2, and upper grades 3 and 6. At Washburn's insistence, each grading group had its own building wing, classrooms, and playground in order to minimize interactions between younger and older children. Each of these wings consisted of spines of single or double-loaded corridors lined with L-shaped classrooms. The classrooms contained both traditional learning space and active workspace, each occupying one arm of the L. They may have been the Crow Island design team's greatest achievement. The main sections were intended for Winnetka group and individual, The main sections were intended for Winnetka Plan group and individual work and could be separated from the workspace by sliding doors. Large glass walls delivered abundant natural light and visually connected children with the outdoors. One entire wall opposite the windows was covered with pine for use as a bulletin board. Workspaces also contained toilets and closets, and the Saarinen created a decorative scheme full of bright colors for each room. The classrooms derived from Larry Perkins' direct experience of Winnetka's progressive curriculum. The educators had identified 4 types of school activities: individual and group academic work, and individual and group non-academic work. After spending the better part of a year sitting in on elementary school classes, Perkins took these 4 activities, added 2 essential elements from school life and from his own observations, handling of clothes and toileting, and used them as the basis for the revolutionary L-shaped classrooms originally laid out by Phil Will. The final revolutionary aspect of Crow Island was its orientation toward children. It was arguably the first school building designed as a children's environment. Movable furniture gave the teachers freedom to arrange desks and tables for different activities. They had specifically requested it in their interviews with the architects. Arrow designed the tables, chairs, desks, and benches, some in conjunction with Charles Ames, to be child-sized and lightweight. Also, the classroom ceilings were only 9 feet rather than the standard 12, and the Saarinen's decorative program enhanced the classroom's playful atmosphere. Lily Swan created a series of whimsical, age-appropriate ceramic plaques, all at eye level for the children, of various animals for the outdoor areas in particular. Additionally, all of the hardware and light switches in the building were adjusted for child height. These innovations revealed the designer's efforts to make the spaces less institutional and more homelike, initiating a movement that would culminate in the casual school of the 1950s. To conclude, I'd like to make 3 points. First, Crow Island was the first school to weave together leading child-centered experiments in pedagogy, architecture, and furniture design. Its unique classrooms were true innovations and would improve educators' ability to vary their teaching around the country. The school building both materialized and symbolized American progressive education. Second, the Crow Island School's final form reveals the design team's sensitivity to the needs and desires of all the school's users, the teachers, administrators, staff, and even students. The Perkins firm interviewed all of the above to learn what they liked, disliked, and wanted in a school. I think the insights gleaned from these communications merged with the designer's innate fascination with and commitment to education to achieve an unprecedented synthesis of teaching, space, and building. And I might add that it continues on, so I don't talk about these, but Lily Swan, who married Errol Saarinen, wrote a children's book, and Heloise Washburn, who was married to Carlton, wrote a ton of books, and they wrote a lot of things together. So everybody involved in this is writing children's books, at least. Finally, this paper grows out of ongoing research into Crow Island in particular and school architecture in general that began here at UVA, when Richard convinced me that looking at school buildings and their relationship to educational changes would make a better dissertation topic than wallowing around in 20th century architectural sculpture or trying to beat something interesting out of the Prairie School. My first two choices. I should have known he'd suggest that option, because way back in one of my first meetings with Richard, I swear it was before I even enrolled. I came up here before I enrolled to talk to him, and I think it was in this one. He mentioned this building, or I mentioned this building, sorry, the former Oliver P. Morton School in Hammond, Indiana. My house as a kid was 3 blocks away. My dad was the principal, and I basically grew up in this building, and it was beautiful. As an adult, I'd done some research on it and discovered it was designed by George Elmsley, a Prairie School hero. So in an attempt to impress Richard, I began to describe the school, but he already knew it. He not only knew it, he'd researched it and written something about it. Later, he'd let me see his file, which included a letter from my dad to match the one that my dad had given me from Richard. So that's a long way of saying thank you to Richard for recognizing that being from an education family, I would probably be passionate about the topic, just like Carlton Washburn, Larry Perkins, and Errol Saarinen. Thank you.
Well, a round of applause for all of our speakers for setting the bar for those to come. And we do have some time if those in the audience have questions before the break, or you would rather corner them on their way to the restroom or after the restroom. Yes, there is a question in the back.
This is just a really dumb question. Why did loewy have an office in South Bend, Indiana? Seems like a strange choice.
Yeah, it was specifically for the Studebaker and the car work that he's doing.
Did everyone hear the answer? Loewy had an office in South Bend, Indiana, because of the work he was doing for Studebaker?
Yeah, for the car.
And I want an Avanti so badly.
I have a question for Christine as well. I noticed that several of your slides you had images from the Heyday. What's the collection there? Is that Lily's stuff?
Yeah, so, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah, so around 2002, 2003, the Hagley acquired a large chunk of the Loewy office archive, and it's varied, but it's especially valuable because it includes a lot of the publicity records. And so there are these enormous, like, size of half my body scrapbooks that Betty Reese collected, and she pasted, like, this is old school clipping, all this stuff in there. And so they have quite a lot of material. And in 2003, they had a symposium and exhibition that Glenn Porter organized once they received that archive. So, yeah, that's the connection.
Yes.
Famous perspective drawing of the home and studio. This is a question for Lisa. As it appears in the Vasco portfolio, does it depict accurately the buildings as they were at that time?
No, they don't. There was a lot of artistic license in those drawings. Some of them were produced from photographs, so kind of after the fact when they were built, but some, like the home and studio, there's definitely differences from what was built. In fact, a lot of the drawing, none of them really come exact, precise. And it's interesting how the building gets longer over time. And some of the proportions looks like he's deliberately manipulating in those.
Because I think of Palladio's 4 books. He had an opportunity to revisit many of his designs. So there's always a discrepancy of how they appear in the
Exactly, and I think when Wright was in Europe, he was taking time as they were reworking. He and then his son Lloyd and Taylor Woolley were redoing all of the drawings, and so I think that really was a time for him to kind of step away and kind of reassess his, personal life, professional life, and try to figure out. He was in a pretty bad place before he left for Europe in both those respects.
Hi, I have a question for Bridget. My apologies as I came in halfway through your presentation, but the Cuban-American architect from Miami, Hilario Candela, and his firm Spillis Candela had, at some point in the late 1980s or early 1990s, acquired or bought the firm of Warneke or something to that effect. I'm not familiar with it. Was that something that was Mr. Warneke's doing? Was it the firm's doing afterwards? Did it have any resonance? Did it flourish?
Is this on? Yeah.
Hilario then retired pretty soon after that.
So Warneke died in 2010, but he retired in 1980. And his daughter was an architect. She had gone to Columbia, and she took over the practice for a period of time. But it was nowhere near what it was at the height of his, when he was second only to Edward Durrell Stone. And she then continued at the firm for a while, but then it sort of dissipated and I think was acquired by the they ended up merging. I don't know the story of that, merging or acquiring portion.
Next chapter.
Yeah, or whatever, yeah. Savior or whatever you want to call it.
Bridget, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Did he talk to Julia Morgan directly during that?
Well, so she was quite elderly at that point. So she died in 1959. His work at Asilomar begins in the mid-50s. So my guess is no. I don't know. But he was, having grown up in the Bay Area and having had a father that was an architect, he knew, he was very attuned to all of the architects practicing. And, I'm certain he knew of her work. I'm certain that he probably did meet her at some point in his life, but I don't know if they had a correspondence. So, yeah. Yeah.
Just to pick up on that, is there something about his personality or the fact that he was so well connected that might help explain?
I think he was a charmer. I also have heard from people that he was quite difficult to get along with. But he's certainly, I know, an architect, who knew? He certainly was very well connected socially, both in California as well as here on the East Coast. His Washington office was, kind of a hub of and he was, out and about and going to events and, promoting himself and his firm. He did that quite well. But his personality seems to indicate that he just sort of, people were drawn to him and liked him, and he managed to charm his way into the Kennedy administration, and his Stanford connections were important to how he got work. He picked his two wives well. The two women that he married were both very well connected.
I just wonder if other architects resented that, perhaps.
I don't think so. I think that he,
I'm just curious.
yeah, I don't know.
It would seem similar.
Yeah.
For example, the work of Charles Goodman, who Richard has worked with, or studied in D.C. He was difficult to get along with, and I think that but he was not. He shunned the media and the press. He actively thought that his work would speak for itself, but he never really got the recognition he deserved either, and that's from a similar era and a similar.
I can say that from looking at the architectural journals, I would say early in Warneke's career, he gets covered pretty well and is touted as this sort of up-and-coming guy. And then it sort of wanes off, and I don't know if that was that he became increasingly corporate, and maybe there was this, I can't, you're too big, you don't pay attention to what you're doing. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Here, I'll let Richard talk.
Well, I think this is a wonderful panel, and it does bring up, what you brought up right here at the end is an architect builds buildings, but if they don't write about them, the heck with them. No, they disappear. You understand. Frank Lloyd Wright, I think, is one of the most excellent examples of this, but also the Sarnans and so forth. But if you have a tree in the forest and it falls, and but you understand that type of thing. But it's really one of the things that I've sort of really learned over the career is that the well-known architects are the guys that really publicize themselves. It's not just being published in a magazine, but publishing the books and all of this. So.
Wonderful. Well, according to the schedule, we should all reconvene.